Hi, welcome. Thanks for joining us. I am Shlomo the CTO at Benchmark Corp. We also have Tom Brightbill, a product manager out of Cloudflare, joining us. He's joined us today because we co-authored a white paper recently, and we want to share a few thoughts together with the wider audience. The context of the white paper is to change how we do multi-cloud today, change the architecture, change the approach, change the viewpoint that everybody has, and hopefully you'll come out of this with a better understanding where you can have more resilient architecture, more available services, more available applications, and a happier talent pool without heroics. So with that, I'll try to set the stage, and then I'm gonna start bothering Tom. My thought here would be, I want to share what I've seen within a lot of enterprises today. They have a very much strategic cloud approach, where they choose a single cloud provider and they plan out the roadmap for adoption. What we're trying to present here is, under the context, we have constraints. The constraints that most organizations have are engineering talent or a talent pool. And generally the perspective is, how do I protect that talent pool from technology sprawl? How do I protect that talent pool from burnout? And the approach is take a stack and go with it. What we'll present today and challenge is how you'll benefit from a multi-cloud approach. When I say multi-cloud, it's not just public, it can be private as well. And how you challenge that mindset and achieve those goals without taxing your talent. Cloudflare has a lot of customers today that do multi-cloud, and I'd really like him to speak to his findings and benefits that his customers are seeing, where you take a content distribution network above the cloud providers and leverage them as entities and commodities for your services. With that, Tom.
Yeah, cool. And no bother at all, Shlomo. Thanks for having me. Yeah, I think it's a really, really interesting topic. We kind of see customers, I think, fall into two big camps when they try to basically look at some sort of multi-cloud approach. I think one is that the services are split completely, and they have maybe some things on premise, and they might move something to one cloud provider or another cloud provider. So these are actually independent services, and they just exist in different areas. Of course, the other one, which is probably kind of more the truer incarnation of multi-cloud, is that you have the same services running on both clouds, and you run either some sort of failover, or you have a way to maybe do a geo-based load balancing, or latency-based or performance-based. But you know, the biggest advantage, I think, in my mind, really under either case, is just you're building the case for a more resilient network. I think, you know, if we know anything about the internet, we know that it's not perfect, and that tier one providers oftentimes will have outages of some kind, and it's oftentimes attributable to fat finger errors, and things like route leaks happen, and RPKI adoption isn't where you want it, and these things affect everybody. So if you're single honed with one cloud provider in a particular region, those are unicast addresses that could get affected by a route leak, and there's nowhere else for those addresses to go other than to the area where the routers that have leaked the prefixes. And even if it's an individual AS, you know, you're in Amazon's network still, you can run into similar issues. So it's really about building the case for resiliency, and maybe doing a little bit more effort upfront, kind of how you mentioned, but then not having to worry on the back, you know, when there's some sort of potential network error or some sort of other service problem too, which is a completely separate sort of problem.
So what I hear you say is, if you pick somewhere as your target, the common theme is going to be that target's going to fail. So you should prepare your site reliability approach and architecture to include the resiliency to that by having multiple providers. I'm going to ask a different brutal truth, and if you agree with it.
Sure.
I find of all the organizations that I chat with, they do have cloud adoption, but I find they're not moving their core business. I'm finding they're putting low-hanging fruit, easy greenfield applications, but they're not taking their core business, which they're frightened to take or move to the cloud. Do you find that context is because they lack the resiliency, or they worry that the cloud lacks the resiliency? What's your perspective on that?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. it sort of comes in a couple different flavors, I think, is at least what I've seen. I mean, one is that there's some sort of PII or some sort of regulatory reason that it has to stay on premise. I've seen this in kind of healthcare and financial industries. Even under certain circumstances, there's maybe even a latency concern. Like if you think about, I don't know, like financial data that must be kept on-prem, interacting with a cloud service versus interacting within the same network locally. Even like high frequency trading and all this kind of stuff actually doesn't even happen on the public internet. But also, I mean, it's just inertia too and what you're comfortable with. And of course, you know, all the providers are going to have their own methodology for this, but my understanding is that Microsoft actually is kind of at the forefront of supporting the hybrid cloud because they had already owned these workflows for customers on premise. And they kind of knew what the requirements were about data governance and stuff like that, and were able to sort of effectively create a bridge into a cloud environment. But our CISO, I think on record, has publicly stated that we're probably going to be in a hybrid environment, basically for the foreseeable future.
Well, you should be leveraging everybody's R&D capabilities and their services that are available. You just need to be able to distribute that traffic. The way I look at it is you have each of them going down that path. You have Azure Stack, you have Outpost, you have Anthos. Each of them recognize that the benefits to having and leveraging multiple providers, maybe not just a strategic one, has some availability benefits. Now, why don't we talk about how we can construct infrastructure, multi-cloud, and deploy applications together so that managing multi-cloud isn't such a big challenge? How do you find your customers are doing that today?
Yeah, and that's a great follow-up from the previous question too, right? Is that if you're already on premise, and maybe there's like some review of you know, CapEx forecast or something like that of investment that you want to make, but you also want to modernize your architecture, all those tools you just mentioned are intended for you to do just that, right? So if you're looking to create something that has a little bit more resiliency built in, maybe something like Kubernetes, right? You're running multiple instances of the same application in a pod. The cloud providers are very well positioned to help with that. And I think they've done that strategically to basically help with this migration from being on premise. These things are easier to operate on the cloud providers, right? They come sort of in a managed service type of a bundle. And you have much better support there. So whenever customers try to do this, they're using some kind of automation tooling, whether that's Kubernetes or just containers, and they're basically finding ways to only create the infrastructure once, but deploy it to both clouds simultaneously.
I want to move into that area of where we're trying to argue that 100% availability is a possibility. Cloudflare obviously has an SLA of 100%, which you commit to, where anything within your control, you will commit to 100% availability. When we talk about the cloud providers, that's generally not the case. And I'm wondering, we've challenged within the white paper how architecture can be built, where if you do multi-cloud, where loads are distributed between the cloud providers, how does that give you higher availability? And then if you have a CDN that also has that availability level, what is the probability of having 100% for a time frame such as a year? Can you speak to how your customers like the idea of having 100% availability?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's all in the sentence you just said, right? It's got 3 numbers. It's a 3-digit number. No, but it's fantastic. I mean, I think this is the dream, right? And it doesn't matter who the provider is, AWS, GCP, Azure, whoever. This is networking. It's computer science. There's always going to be a problem, right? And so if you're able to kind of like front your network and kind of put a shield around it with a network like Cloudflare's, where you know, let's say even a pop goes down or something, we'll just, Anycast will basically resolve the traffic to the second nearest location. And then you have this ability to basically dynamically steer to whichever one of the cloud providers is most available or most performant or most et cetera at the time. So I think it's a really excellent goal. I think that the challenge here will just be to show that the path isn't nearly as scary as you want, and make the case that this is all the things that you don't have to deal with when you do this, right? Like dealing with outages and customer complaints and failures of just one of the cloud providers.
I think the last challenge that we'll touch on today will be regarding cost. There's a lot of those that will say, if I run multi-cloud, I'm going to have unforeseen costs or exponential costs because I have so many environments. In the paper, we touched on a different architecture. We touched on architecture that doesn't require availability zone resilience, where it doesn't require regional resilience. We're using Cloudflare to distribute distinct and individual workloads within each cloud. Why don't you talk to how you find your customers manage the cost, or maybe find cost efficiencies by using multi-cloud, but changing their approach, changing their architecture so that you don't have runaway costs?
Yeah, also a great point. I mean, obviously taking advantage of a caching layer, like something that Cloudflare can do is a huge piece of this. Obviously we're going to peer with all of the major cloud providers, and hopefully we can offload a lot of the traffic that you wouldn't get billed for egress or usage or whatever it is. You could even, cache database responses for short periods of times, or, do things with workers that are very creative. But on the actual cloud provider side, yeah, like as you said, right, you don't have to worry about resiliency within the same cloud provider becomes less important. It's just you have resiliency now between two cloud providers. So instead of, I don't know, being in US East and also US West in GCP or AWS, you can just be in one provider in each of those places. So the cost structure in some ways should look similar if you look at failover a little bit different and don't think of it as within the cloud provider, which you do need to have some aspect of this, but you look at it as between the cloud providers.
Correct. Yeah, you would have in the architecture, you would have active, 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 technically, depending on how many clouds you have. I'm going to ask you a challenge here. If you have 3 cloud providers and the data that we found in the white paper shows that they don't all go down at the same time, do you actually have a DR event? In this case, as long as one of the providers is going, the capacity would move to the available one. And then do you actually need to have a DR capacity whatsoever? Do you failover? Yes, failover of capacity, not failover between sites, like, oh, I've lost a site, so now I need to move everything over. In this case, it's just moving not spare capacity, but lost capacity to the available cloud providers. What's your thoughts to expand?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an excellent model and kind of flips the whole thing on its head. You don't have to, I guess, provision things or pay for resources kind of just in case. You're just ready at all times. And not only do you get, of course, the benefits of the failover, like you mentioned, but then you can also make the customer experience better because, latency-based steering, things like that, they're always going to go to the closest provider.
I think on that, I'll aim with a closing statement, which basically says our architecture is built on a customer experience perspective, which is I never want your stuff to come down. I need it to be resilient, so when I use it, it's available. Based on the data and analysis and architecture we put together, we're going to maintain that or despite the statements that 100% availability isn't possible. Within a year, totally possible. I think the paper very clearly dictates that, also shows the operational savings when you're able to distribute between cloud providers the resiliency rather than putting resiliency into a single cloud provider in multiple ways, right? You don't just do availability zones, you also do regions. In this case, you don't need to do either, really. You just need to have independent workloads within each cloud that then are resilient for each other. So thanks so much for joining us. Hopefully the audience takes away some nuggets and looking forward to getting some customers implementing that new architecture with you.
Cool. Yeah. Thanks so much, Shlomo. It's been a pleasure.
Cheers.